Alright guys, chapter 8 of Tortilla Flat. How Danny's friends sought mystic treasure on St. Andrew's Eve. How Pilon found it, and later now a pair of surge pants changed ownership twice. And later how a pair of surge pants changed ownership twice. So chapter 8. If he had been a hero, the Portuguese would have spent a miserable time in the army. The fact that he was Big Joe Portuguese with a decent training in Monterey jail not only saved him the misery of patriotism thwarted, but solidified his conviction that as a man's days are rightly devoted half to sleeping and half to waking, so a man's years are rightly spent half in jail and half out. Of the duration of the war, Joe Portuguese spent considerably more time in jail than out. In civilian life, one is punished for things one does, but army codes add a new principle to this. They punish a man for things he does not do. Joe Portuguese never did figure this out. He didn't clean his rifle, he didn't shave, and once or twice on leave he didn't come back. Coupled with these shortcomings was a propensity Big Joe had for genial argument when he was taken to task. Ordinarily, he spent half his time in jail. Of 2 years in the army, he spent 18 months in jail, and he was far from satisfied with prison life in the army. In the Monterey jail, he was accustomed to ease and companionship. In the army, he found only work. In Monterey, only one charge was ever brought against him: drunk and disorderly conduct. The charges in the army bewildered him so completely that the effect on his mind was probably permanent. When the war was over and all the troops were disbanded, Big Joe still had 6 months' sentence to serve. The charge had been being drunk on duty, striking a sergeant with a kerosene can, denying his identity. He couldn't remember it, so he denied everything, stealing 2 gallons of cooked beans and going AWOL on the major's horse. If the armistice had not already been signed, Big Joe would probably have been shot. He came home to Monterey long after the other veterans had arrived and had eaten up all the sweets of victory. When Big Joe swung down from the train, he was dressed in an army overcoat and tunic and a pair of blue serge trousers. The town hadn't changed much except for prohibition, and prohibition hadn't changed Torelli's. Joe traded his overcoat for a gallon of wine and went out to find his friends. True friends he found none that night, but in Monterey he found no lack of those vile and false harpies and pimps who are ever ready to lead men into the pit. Joe, who was not very moral, had no revulsion for the pit. He liked it. Before very many hours had passed, his wine was gone and he had no money, and then the harpies tried to get Joe out of the pit, and he wouldn't go. He was comfortable there. When they tried to eject him by force, Big Joe, with a just and terrible resentment, broke all the furniture and all the windows, sent half-clothed girls screaming into the night, and then as an afterthought set fire to the house. It was not a safe thing to lead Joe into temptation. He had no resistance to it at all. A policeman finally interfered and took him in hand. The Portuguese sighed happily. He was home again. After a short and juryless trial in which he was sentenced to 30 days, Joe lay luxuriously on his leather cot and slept heavily for 1/10 of his sentence. The Portuguese, like the Monterey jail, was a place to meet people. If he stayed there long enough, all his friends were in and out. The time passed quickly. He was a little sad when he had to go, but his sadness was tempered with the knowledge that it was very easy to get back again. He would have liked to go into the pit again, but he had no money and no wine. He combed the streets for his old friends, Pilon and Danny and Pablo, and could not find them. The police sergeant said he hadn't booked them for a long time. They must be dead, said the Portuguese, so I think he's Portuguese. He wandered sadly to Torelli's, but Torelli was not friendly toward men who had neither money nor barterable property, and he gave Big Joe little solace. But Torelli did say that Danny had inherited a house on Tortilla Flat, and that all his friends lived there with him. Affection and a desire to see his friends came to Big Joe. In the evening he wandered up toward Tortilla Flat to find Danny and Pilon. It was dusk as he walked up the street, and on the way he met Pilon, hurrying by in a businesslike way. "Hey, Pilon, I was just coming to see you." "Hello, Joe Portuguese." Pilon was brusque. "Where you been?" "In the army," said Joe. Pilon's mind was not on the meeting. "I have to go on." "I will go with you," said Joe. Pilon stopped and surveyed him. Don't you remember what night it is?" he asked. "No, what is it?" "It is St. Andrew's Eve." Then the Portuguese knew, for this was the night when every paisano who wasn't in jail wandered restlessly through the forest. This was the night when all buried treasures sent up a faint phosphorescent glow through the ground. There was plenty of treasure in the woods, too. Monterey had been invaded many times in 200 years, and each time valuables had been hidden in the earth. The night was clear. Balone had emerged from his hard daily shell as he did now and then. So the night was clear. Balone had emerged from his hard daily shell as he did now and then. He was the idealist tonight, the giver of gifts. This night he was engaged in a mission of kindness. You may come with me, Big Joe Portuguese, but if we find any treasure, I must decide what to do with it. If you do not agree, you can go by yourself and look for your own treasure. Big Joe was not an expert at directing his own efforts. I will go with you, Balone, he said. I don't care about the treasure. The night came down as they walked into the forest. Their feet found the pine needle beds. Now Balone knew it for a perfect night. A high fog covered the sky, and behind it the moon shone so that the forest was filled with a gauze-like light. There was none of the sharp outline we think of as reality. The tree trunks were not black columns of wood, but soft and unsubstantial shadows. The patches of brush were formless and shifting in the queer light. Ghosts could walk freely tonight without fear of the disbelief of men, for this night was haunted, and it would be an insensitive man who did not know it. Now and then Balone and Big Joe passed other searchers who wandered restlessly, zigzagging among the pines. Their heads were down, and they moved silently and passed no greeting. Who could say whether all of them were really living men? Joe and Balone knew that some were shades of those old folk who had buried the treasures and who, on St. Andrew's Eve, wandered back to the earth to see that their gold was undisturbed. Balone wore his saint's medallion hung around his neck outside his clothes, so he had no fear of the spirits. Big Joe walked with his fingers crossed in the holy sign. Although they might be frightened, they knew they had protection more than adequate to cope with the unearthly night. The wind arose as they walked and drove the fog across the pale moon like a thin wash of gray watercolor. The moving fog gave shifting form to the forest so that every tree crept stealthily along. The bushes moved soundlessly like great dark cats. The treetops in the wind talked huskily, told fortunes and foretold deaths. Balone knew it was not good to listen to the talking of the trees. No good ever came of knowing the future, and besides, this whispering was unholy. He turned the attention of his ears from the trees talking. He began a zigzag path through the forest, and Big Joe walked beside him like a great alert dog. Lone silent men passed them and went on without a greeting, and the dead passed them noiselessly and went on without a greeting. The fog siren began its screaming on the point far below them, and it wailed its sorrow for all the good ships that had drowned on the iron reef, and for all those others that would sometime die there. Balone shuddered and felt cold. Although the night was warm, he whispered a Hail Mary under his breath. They passed a gray man who walked with his head down and who gave them no greeting. An hour went by, and still Balone and Big Joe wandered as restlessly as the dead who crowded the night. Suddenly Balone stopped. His hand found Big Joe's arm. "Do you see?" he whispered. "Where?" "Right ahead there." "Yes, I think so." It seemed to Balone that he could see a soft pillar of blue light that shone out of the ground 10 yards ahead of him. "Big Joe," he whispered, "find 2 sticks about 3 or 4 feet long. I do not want to look away. I might lose it." He stood like a pointing dog while Big Joe scurried off to find the sticks. Balone heard him break 2 small dead limbs from a pine tree, and he heard the snaps as Big Joe broke the twigs from his sticks. And still Balone stared at the pale shaft of nebulous light. So faint it was that sometimes it seemed to disappear altogether. Sometimes he was not sure he saw it at all. He did not move his eyes when Big Joe put the sticks in his hands. Balone crossed the sticks at right angles and advanced slowly, holding the cross in front of him. As he came close, the light seemed to fade away, but he saw where it had come from, a perfectly round depression in the pine needles. Balone laid his cross over the depression, and he said, "All that lies here is mine by discovery. Go away, all evil spirits. Go away, spirits of men who buried this treasure. In nomen Patris et Filius et Spiritus Sancti." And then he heaved a great sigh and sat down on the ground. "We have found it, oh my friend Big Joe," he cried. "For many years I have looked, and now I have found it." "Let's dig," said Big Joe. But Balone shook his head impatiently. "When all the spirits are free, when even to be here is dangerous, you are a fool, Big Joe. We will sit here until morning, and then we will mark the place, and tomorrow night we will dig. No one else can see the light now that we have covered it with the cross. Tomorrow night there will be no danger." The night seemed more fearful now that they sat in the pine needles, but the cross sent out a warmth of holiness and safety, like a little bonfire on the ground. Like a fire, however, it only warmed the front of them. Their backs were to be cold, and evil things that wandered about in the forest. Their backs were to be cold, and evil things that wandered about in the forest. Balone got up and drew a big circle around the whole place, and he was inside when he closed the circle. "Let no evil thing cross this line, in the name of the most holy Jesus," he chanted. Then he sat down again. Both he and Big Joe felt better. They could hear the muffled footsteps of the weary wandering ghosts. They could see the little lights that glowed from the transparent forms as they walked by. But the protecting line was impregnable. Nothing bad from this world or from any other world could cross into the circle. "What are you going to do with the money?" Big Joe asked. Balone looked at him with contempt. "You have never looked for treasure, Big Joe Portuguese, for you do not know how to go about it. I cannot keep this treasure for myself. If I go after it, intending to keep it, then the treasure will dig itself down and down like a clam in the sand, and I shall never find it. No, that is not the way. I am digging this treasure for Danny." All the idealism in Balone came out then. He told Big Joe how good Danny was to his friends. "And we do nothing for him," he said. "We pay no rent. Sometimes we get drunk and break the furniture. We fight with Danny when we are angry with him, and we call him names. Oh, we are very bad, Big Joe. And so all of us, Pablo and Jesus Maria and the pirate and I, talked and planned. We are all in the woods tonight looking for treasure, and the treasure is to be for Danny. He is so good, Big Joe. He is so kind, and we are so bad. But if we take a great sack of treasure to him, then he will be glad. It is because my heart is clean of selfishness that I can find this treasure." "Won't you keep any of it?" Big Joe asked, incredulous. "Not even for a gallon of wine?" Balone had no speck of the bad Balone in him this night. No, not one scrap of gold, not one little brown penny. It is all for Danny, every bit. Joe was disappointed. "I walked all this way and I won't even get a glass of wine for it," he mourned. "When Danny has the money," Balone said delicately, "it may be that he will buy a little wine. Of course I shall not suggest it, for this treasure is Danny's, but I think maybe he might buy a little wine, and then if you were good to him, you might get a glass." Big Joe was comforted, for he had known Danny a long time. He thought it possible that Danny might buy a great deal of wine. The night passed on over them. The moon went down and left the forest in muffled darkness. The fog sirens screamed and screamed. During the whole night, Balone remained unspotted. He preached a little to Big Joe, as recent converts are likely to do. "It is worth while to be kind and generous," he said. "Not only do such actions pile up a house of joy in heaven, but there is, too, a quick reward here on earth. One feels a golden warmth glowing like a hot enchilada in one's stomach. The Spirit of God clothes one in a coat as soft as camel's hair. I have not always been a good man, Big Joe Portuguese. I confess it freely." Big Joe knew it perfectly well. "I have been bad," Balone continued ecstatically. He was enjoying himself thoroughly. "I have lied and stolen. I have been lecherous. I have committed adultery and taken God's name in vain." "Me too," said Big Joe happily. "And what was the result, Big Joe Portuguese? I have had a mean feeling. I have known I would go to hell, but now I see that the sinner is never so bad that he cannot be forgiven. Although I have not yet been to confession, I can feel that the change in me is pleasing to God, for His grace is upon me. If you, too, would change your ways, Big Joe, if you would give up drunkenness and fighting and those girls down at Dora Williams' house, you too might feel as I do." But Big Joe had gone to sleep. He never stayed awake very long when he was not moving about. The grace was not quite so sharp to Balone when he could not tell Big Joe about it. But he sat and watched the treasure place while the sky grayed and the dawn came behind the fog. He saw the pine trees take shape and emerge out of obscurity. The wind died down and the little blue rabbits came out of the brush and hopped about on the pine needles. Balone was heavy-eyed but happy. When it was light, he stirred Big Joe Portuguese with his foot. "It is time to go to Danny's house. The day has come." Balone threw the cross away, for it was no longer needed, and he erased the circle. "Now," he said, "we must make no mark, but we must remember this by trees and rocks." "Why don't we dig now?" Big Joe asked. "And everybody in Tortilla Flat will come to help us," Balone said sarcastically. They looked hard at the surroundings, saying, "Now there are 3 trees together on the right and 2 on the left. That patch of brush is down there, and here is a rock." At last they walked away from the treasure, memorizing the way as they went. At Danny's house they found tired friends. "Did you find any?" the friends demanded. "No," said Balone quickly, to forestall Joe's confession. "Well, Pablo thought he saw the light, but it disappeared before he got to it, and the pirate saw the ghost of an old woman, and she had his dog with her." The pirate broke into a smile. "That old woman told me that my dog was happy now," he said. "Here is Big Joe Portuguese, back from the army," announced Balone. "Hello, Joe. You got a nice place here," said the Portuguese, and let himself down easily into a chair. "You keep out of my bed," said Danny, for he knew that Joe Portuguese had come to stay. The way he sat in a chair and crossed his knees had an appearance of permanence. The pirate went out and took his wheelbarrow and started into the forest to cut his kindlings, but the other 5 men lay down in the sunshine that broke through the fog, and in a little while they were asleep. It was mid-afternoon before any of them awakened. At last they stretched their arms and sat up and looked listlessly down at the bay below, where a brown oil tanker moved slowly out to sea. The pirate had left the bags on the table, and the friends opened them and brought out the food the pirate had collected. Big Joe walked down the path toward the sagging gate. "See you later," he called to Balone. Balone anxiously watched him until he saw that Big Joe was headed down the hill to Monterey, not up toward the pine forest. The four friends sat down and dreamily watched the evening come. At dusk, Joe Portuguese returned. He and Balone conferred in the yard, out of earshot of the house. "We will borrow tools from Mrs. Morales," Balone said, "a shovel and a pickaxe, down by her chicken house." When it was quite dark, they started. "We go to see some girls, friends of Joe Portuguese," Balone explained. They crept into Mrs. Morales' yard and borrowed the tools, and then, from the weeds beside the road, Big Joe lifted out a gallon of jug of wine. "Thou hast sold the treasure," Balone cried fiercely. "Thou art a traitor, O dog of a dog." Big Joe quieted him firmly. "I did not tell where the treasure was," he said with some dignity. "I told like this. We found a treasure, I said, but it is for Danny. When Danny has it, I will borrow $1 and pay for the wine." Balone was overwhelmed. "And they believed and let you take the wine?" he demanded. "Well," Big Joe hesitated, "I left something to prove I would bring the $1. Balone turned like lightning and took him by the throat. "What did you leave?" "Only one little blanket, Balone," Joe Portuguese wailed. "Only one." Balone shook at him, but Big Joe was so heavy that Balone only succeeded in shaking himself. "What blanket?" he cried. "Say what blanket it was you stole." Big Joe blubbered. "Only one of Danny's, only one. He has two. I took only the little tiny one. Do not hurt me, Balone. The other one was bigger. Danny will get it back when we find the treasure." Balone whirled him around and kicked him with accuracy and fire. "Pig," he said, "dirty thieving cow. You will get the blanket back or I will beat you to ribbons." Big Joe tried to placate him. "I thought how we are working for Danny," he whispered. "I thought Danny will be so glad. He can buy 100 new blankets." "Be still," said Balone. "You will get that same blanket back or I will beat you with a rock." He took up the jug and uncorked it and drank a little to soothe his frayed sensibilities. Moreover, he drove the cork back and refused the Portuguese even a drop. "For this theft, he must do all the digging. Pick up those tools and come with me." Big Joe whined like a puppy and obeyed. He could not stand against the righteous fury of Balone. They tried to find the treasure for a long time. It was late when Balone pointed to 3 trees in a row. "There," he said. They searched about until they found the depression in the ground. There was a little moonlight to guide them, for this night the sky was free of fog, because fog makes it like brighter. Now that he was not going to dig, Balone developed a new theory for uncovering treasure. "Sometimes the money is in sacks," he said, "and the sacks are rotted. If you dig straight down, you might lose some." He drew a generous circle around the hollow. Now dig a deep trench around, and then we will come up on the treasure." "Aren't you going to dig?" Big Joe asked. Balone broke into fury. "Am I a thief of blankets?" he cried. "Do I steal from the bed of my friend who shelters me?" "Well, I ain't going to do all the digging," Big Joe said. Balone picked up one of the pine limbs that only the night before had served as part of the cross. He advanced ominously toward Big Joe Portuguese. "Thief," he snarled. "Dirty pig of an untrue friend. Take up that shovel." Big Joe's courage flowed away, and he stooped for the shovel on the ground. If Joe Portuguese's conscience had not been bad, he might have remonstrated, but his fear of Balone, armed with a righteous cause and a stick of pine wood, was great. Big Joe abhorred the whole principle of shoveling. The line of the moving shovel was unattractive. The end to be gained, that of taking dirt from one place and putting it in another, was to one who held the larger vision silly and gainless. A whole lifetime of shoveling could accomplish practically nothing. Big Joe's reaction was a little more simple than this. He didn't like to shovel. He had joined the army to fight and had done nothing but dig. But Balone stood over him, and the trench stretched around the treasure place. It did no good to profess sickness, hunger, or weakness. Balone was inexorable, and Joe's crime of the blanket was held against him. Although he whined, complained, held up his hands to show how they were hurt, Balone stood over him and forced the digging. So Balone was inexorable. Midnight came and the trench was 3 feet down. The roosters of Monterey crowed. The moon sank behind the trees. At last Balone gave the word to move in on the treasure. The bursts of dirt came slowly now. Big Joe was exhausted. Just before daylight his shovel struck something hard. "Hey," he cried, "we have it, Balone." The find was large and square. Frantically they dug at it in the dark, and they could not see it. "Careful," Balone cautioned. "Do not hurt it." The daylight came before they had it out. Balone felt metal and leaned down in the great light to see. It was a good-sized square of concrete. On top was a round brown plate. Balone spelled out the words on it. "United States Geodetic Survey plus 1950 plus elevation 600 feet. Balone sat down in the pit and his shoulders sagged in defeat. "No treasure?" Big Joe asked plaintively. Balone did not answer him. The Portuguese inspected the cement post, and his brow wrinkled with thought. He turned to the sorrowing Balone. "Maybe we can take this good piece of metal and sell it." Balone peered up out of his dejection. "Johnny Pom-Pom found one," he said with the quietness of great disappointment. "Johnny Pom-Pom took the metal piece and tried to sell it. It is a year in jail to dig one of these up," Balone mourned. "A year in jail and $2,000 fine." In his pain, Balone wanted only to get away from this tragic place. He stood up, found a weed in which to wrap the wine bottle, and started down the hill. Big Joe trotted after him solicitously. "Where are we going?" he asked. "I don't know," said Pallone. The day was bright when they arrived at the beach, but even there Pallone did not stop. He trudged along the hard sand by the water's edge until Monterey was far behind, and only the sand dunes of Seaside and the rippling waves of the bay were there to see his sorrow. At last he sat in the dry sand with the sun warming him. Big Joe sat beside him, and he felt that in some way he was responsible for Pallone's silent pain. Pallone took the jug out of its weed and uncorked it and drank deeply, and because sorrow is the mother of a general compassion, he passed Joe's wine to the miscreant Joe. "How we build," Pallone cried. "How our dreams lead us. I had thought how we would carry bags of gold to Danny. I could see how his face would look. He would be surprised. For a long time he would not believe it." He took the bottle from Joe Portuguese and drank colossally. "All this is gone, blown away in the night." The sun was warming the beach now. In spite of his disappointment, Pallone felt a traitorous comfort stealing over him, a treacherous impulse to discover some good points in the situation. Big Joe, in his quiet way, was drinking more than his share of the wine. Pallone took it indignantly and drank again and again. "But after all," he said philosophically, "maybe if we had found gold, it might not have been good for Danny. He has always been a poor man. Riches might make him crazy." Big Joe nodded solemnly. The wine went down and down in the bottle. "Happiness is better than riches," said Pallone. "If we try to make Danny happy, it will be a better thing than to give him money." Big Joe nodded again and took off his shoes. "Make him happy, that's the stuff." Pallone turned sadly upon him. "You are only a pig and not fit to live with men," he said gently. "You who stole Danny's blanket should be kept in a sty and fed potato peelings." They were getting very sleepy in the warm sun. The little waves whispered along the beach. Pallone took off his shoes. "Even Steven," said Big Joe, and they drained the jug to the last drop. The beach was swaying gently, heaving and falling with a movement like a ground swell. "You aren't a bad man," Pallone said, but Big Joe Portuguese was already asleep. Pallone took off his coat and laid it over his face. In a few moments he too was sleeping sweetly. The sun wheeled over the sky. The tide spread up the beach and then retreated. A squad of scampering killdeers inspected the sleeping men. A wandering dog sniffed them. Two elderly ladies collecting seashells saw the bodies and hurried past, lest these men should awaken in passion, pursue, and criminally assault them. It was a shame. They agreed that the police did nothing to control such matters. "They are drunk," one said, and the other stared back up the beach at the sleeping men. "Drunken beasts," she agreed. When at last the sun went behind the pines of the hill and back of Monterey, Pallone awakened. His mouth was as dry as a lum. His head ached and he was stiff from the hard sand. Big Joe snored on. "Joe," Pallone cried, but the Portuguese was beyond call. Pallone rested on his elbow and stared out to the sea. A little wine would be good for my dry mouth, he thought. He tipped up the jug and got not a single drop to soothe his dry tongue. Then he turned out his pockets in the hope that while he slept some miracle had taken place there, but none had. There was a broken pocket knife for which he had been refused a glass of wine at least 20 times. There was a fish hook in a cork, a piece of dirty string, a dog's tooth, and several keys that fit nothing Pallone knew of. And the whole lot was not a thing Torelli would consider as worth having, even in a moment of insanity. Pallone looked speculatively at Big Joe. "Poor fellow," he thought. "When Joe Portuguese wakes up, he will feel as dry as I do. He will like it if I have a little wine for him." He pushed Big Joe roughly several times, and when the Portuguese only mumbled and then snored again, Pallone looked through his pockets. He found a brass pants button, a little metal disc which said, "Good eats at the Dutchman," 4 or 5 headless matches, and a little piece of chewing tobacco. Pallone sat back on his heels, so it was no use. He must wither here on the beach while his throat called lustily for wine. He noticed the serge trousers the Portuguese was wearing and stroked them with his fingers. Nice cloth, he thought. Why should this dirty Portuguese wear such good cloth when all his friends go about in jeans? Then he remembered how badly the pants fit Big Joe, how tight the waist was, even with 2 fly buttons undone, how the cuffs missed the shoe tops by inches. Someone of a decent size would be happy in those pants. Pallone remembered Big Joe's crime against Danny, and he became an avenging angel. How did this black Portuguese dare to insult Danny so? When he wakes up, I will beat him. But the more subtle Pallone argued his crime was theft. Would it not teach him a lesson to know how it feels to have something stolen? What good is punishment unless something is learned? It was a triumphant position for Pallone. If with one action he could avenge Danny, discipline Big Joe, teach an ethical lesson, ethical lesson and get a little wine, who in the world would criticize him? He pushed the Portuguese vigorously, and Big Joe brushed at him as though he were a fly. Malone deftly removed the trousers, rolled them up, and sauntered away into the sand dunes. Torelli was out, but Mrs. Torelli opened the door to Malone. He was mysterious in his manner, but at last he held up the pants for her inspection. She shook her head decisively. "But look," said Malone, "you are seeing only the spots and the dirt. Look at this fine cloth underneath. Think, senora. You have cleaned the spots off and pressed the trousers. Torelli comes in, he is silent, he is glum, and then you bring him these fine pants. See how his eyes grow bright? See how happy he is? He takes you on his lap. Look how he smiles at you, senora. Is so much happiness too high at 1 gallon of red wine?" "The seat of the pants is thin," she said. He held them up to the light. "Can you see through them?" "No, the stiffness, the discomfort is taken out of them. They are in prime condition." "No," she said firmly. "You are cruel to your husband, senora. You deny him happiness. I should not be surprised to see him going to other women who are not so heartless. For a quart, then." So he's asking for a quart. "For a quart, then." Finally, her resistance was beaten down, and she gave him the quart. Malone drank it off immediately. "You try to break down the price of pleasure," he warned her. "I should have 1/2 gallon." Mrs. Torelli was hard as stone. Not a drop more could Malone get. He sat there brooding in the kitchen. "Jewess, that's what she is. She cheats me out of Big Joe's pants." Malone thought sadly of his friend out there on the beach. What could he do? If he came into town, he would be arrested. And what had his harpy done to deserve the pants? She had tried to buy Malone's friend's pants for a miserable quart of miserable wine. Malone found himself dissolving into anger at her. "I'm going away in a moment," he told Mrs. Torelli. The pants were hung in a little alcove off the kitchen. "Goodbye," said Mrs. Torelli over her shoulder. She went into her little pantry to prepare dinner. On his way out, Malone passed the alcove and lifted down not only the pants but Danny's blanket. Malone walked back down the beach toward the place where he had left Big Joe. He could see a bonfire burning brightly on the sand, and as he drew nearer, a number of small dark figures passed in front of the flame. It was very dark now. He guided himself by the fire. As he came close, he saw that it was a Girl Scout weenie bake. He approached warily. For a while he could not see Big Joe, but at last he discovered him lying half covered with sand, speechless with cold and agony. Malone walked firmly up to him and held up the pants. "Take them, Big Joe, and be glad you have them back." Joe's teeth were chattering. "Who stole my pants, Malone? I've been lying here for hours, and I cannot go away because of those girls." Malone obligingly stood between Big Joe and the little girls who were running about the bonfire. The Portuguese brushed the cold damp sand from his legs and put on his pants. They walked side by side along the dark beach toward Monterey, where the lights hung necklace above necklace against the hill. The sand dunes crouched along the back of the beach like tired hounds, resting on the waves, gently practiced at striking, and hissed a little. The night was cold and aloof, and its warm life was withdrawn, so that it was full of bitter warnings to man that he is alone in the world, and alone among his fellows, that he has no comfort owing him from anywhere. Malone was still brooding, and Joe Portuguese sensed the depth of his feeling. At last Malone turned his head toward his friend. "We learn by this that it is of great foolishness to trust a woman," he said. "Did some woman take my pants?" Big Joe demanded excitedly. "Who was it? I'll kick the hell out of her." But Malone shook his head as sadly as old Jehovah, who, resting on the seventh day, sees that his world is tiresome. "She is punished," Malone said. "You might say she punished herself, and that is the best way. She had thy pants, she bought them with greed, and now she has them not." These things were beyond Big Joe. They were mysteries it was better to let alone. And this was as Malone wished. This is as Malone wished it. Big Joe said humbly, "Thanks for getting my pants back, Malone." But Malone was so sunk in philosophy that even thanks were valueless. "It was nothing," he said. "In the whole matter, only the lesson we learn has any value." They climbed up from the beach and passed the great silver tower of the gasworks. Big Joe Portuguese was happy to be with Malone. Here is one who takes care of his friends, he thought. Even when they sleep, he is alert to see that no harm comes to them. He resolved to do something nice for Malone sometime. You guys are fucking satirical, man. My eye doctor was right. He said this shit's kind of funny. I wonder if they banned this book. He makes fun of Jews. It's funny. Anyway, peace.